Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth annual Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Symposium held here and hosted by SALISES St. Augustine. My name is Hamid Ghany. I'm Director of SALISES at St. Augustine, and I want to welcome all of you, both panelists and attendees. And we just opened the room so that the attendees list continues to grow. We're very happy that you've taken the time to join us this afternoon. And let me just lay out the way in which we shall proceed. There are four presenters this afternoon: Dr. Preeya Mohan, who is a fellow here at SALISES St. Augustine, myself as director, Dr. Don Marshall, who is the director of SALISES at the Cave Hill campus in Barbados, and Dr. Tyehimba Salandy, who is a fellow here at the St. Augustine campus of SALISES. The forum revolves around the life and work of Sir Arthur Lewis and issues that Sir Arthur Lewis would have dealt with in terms of his life and his work. And we're happy to memorialize this event every year at this time. Of course, his birthday would have been the 23rd of January, but because that day fell on a Saturday, we had to go with either Friday last or Monday, so we went with today. We're having this event. So welcome to everyone who is coming into the room, and I still see that the attendees list is growing, so we welcome all of you today. The order of presentation will be that Dr. Mohan will go first, I will come second, Dr. Marshall will come third, and then Dr. Salandy will come fourth. We have about 20 to 30 minutes for each presentation, and then we will take questions at the end. Questions can be sent via the chat and will be repeated on air, and depending on who it's directed to, that person will be called upon to speak. We estimate that we have about an hour for discussion at the end of the proceedings. I would want now to get things underway, and the first presenter is going to be Dr. Preeya Mohan, and she is going to speak on the subject of COVID-19 lessons from Lewis. So I invite Dr. Preeya Mohan, fellow at SALISES St. Augustine, to make her presentation this afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. Mohan, and welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Ghany, for this opportunity to present today and to celebrate the life and work of Sir Arthur Lewis, after whom our institute is named. So today I'll be presenting on COVID-19 lessons from Lewis. In looking at the life and work of Sir Arthur Lewis, one could say his greatest economic contribution to the Caribbean is that he was the first person to formulate a coherent strategy of economic development for the region. During the time of Lewis's writing in the 1930s, Caribbean economies were mainly agriculture-based, and sugar was the chief crop, though other products such as tobacco, cotton, cocoa, coffee, and bananas were also produced. The sole purpose of the region was to produce agricultural products to export to the imperial powers, which were then processed and re-exported. The Great Depression carried on during this time, and the British West Indian labor unrest took place, which encompassed a series of strikes and riots in the British Caribbean colonies. The unrest served to highlight the inequalities of wealth, led to British government to attempt a solution to the problem and the development of indigenous political parties that would eventually lead to self-government and independence for the Caribbean. The riots led the British government to commission the Moyne Report and publish an economic plan for Jamaica prepared by F. Benham. The Moyne Commission concluded that the region should not engage in industrial activity since it lacked raw materials, capital, and industrial skills, and the domestic market was too small and fragmented to support large-scale industrial production. Both the report and plan was severely criticized by Lewis, who acknowledged that It implied recognition that positive measures to raise the standard of living in the colonies should have high priority. Lewis argued that it was necessary to distinguish between social welfare and economic development. He stated, and I quote, "The principal object of colony policy should be to establish the colonies to stand on their own legs as soon as possible. This can only be done through their rapid economic development." Lewis then outlined a strategy for industrial development for Jamaica based on his review of the industrial development experience of Puerto Rico. Lewis advocated the need for industrial development using local raw materials, including sugar refining, chocolate making, and dairy products. His paper, Industrialization of the British West Indies, published in 1950, provided a fully articulated framework for the capitalist industrial development in small island states of the Caribbean. These works were then later developed to the more general economic model in Lewis's paper, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, and this article is what led Lewis to introduce the dual sector model and him receiving the Nobel Prize in economics. Lewis identified small size of local markets, scarcity of domestic capital, and limited marketing skills as the main obstacles to growth facing the region. He proposed that in order to overcome these barriers, Caribbean countries should export to the international market and form a customs union to take advantage of economies of scale, as well as attract foreign firms to overcome the problems of capital scarcity and poor marketing skills. This strategy was later termed export-led, labor-intensive strategy for industrial development. Lewis stated that industrialization should be based on the use of local natural resources, and this strategy was then referred to as export-led, natural resource-based industrialization. Based on the experience of Puerto Rico, Lewis stated that great emphasis should be placed on foreign investment and the granting of fiscal incentives, which was later termed export-led industrialization by invitation. In the end, Lewis identified three main elements to approach industrial development in the Caribbean. These were markets, resource availability, and economic policy formulation. With that introduction to Lewis and his work, we now shift our attention to the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 is a global complex crisis, and we are all adjusting to the new normal and now live in a changed world. COVID-19 is spreading human and economic suffering worldwide. The virus is as contagious economically as it is medically. As the health and human toll grows, the pandemic represents the largest economic shock the world has experienced in decades. The COVID-19 outbreak was triggered in December 2019 in the city of Wuhan, China, and on 11th March 2020, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Today, we have over 96 million cases and over 2 million deaths globally, and these figures continue to rise. We have over 50 vaccines on trial with approximately 3 approved for use. While some countries have been able to effectively treat and isolate reported cases, it is uncertain when and where new cases will emerge as we battle the second wave. Now, we have seen the epicenter of this virus move from Wuhan to Italy to Spain to New York and the rest of the US, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. Looking at the Caribbean, we had our first imported case of COVID-19 back in March 2020. The Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPHA, upgraded the risk of disease transmission to the region as very high. Currently, we have approximately over 400,000 confirmed cases over 33 Caribbean countries and territories, and about 6,000 deaths. Containment of the virus in the Caribbean has been largely achieved up to this point relative to other countries. Now, given that COVID-19 is new, to flatten the curve of infection, social distancing measures, shelter-in-place orders, and border closures were implemented to reduce personal contact to spread the halt of the virus, and we are still living with some of these measures in place. Now, while some countries have shown that testing, contact tracing, self-isolating, and quarantining can be effective, they are not easily implemented. There are high costs involved and a pool of skilled and experienced contact tracers and other medical professionals are required, which many countries in the Caribbean we just do not have. Just today we saw that New Zealand has now reported its first community case after just 2 months of no cases by community spread. So in the end, these measures implemented brought about an economic shock, bringing economic activity to a near standstill. What is the nature of this economic shock we face? Looking at the nature of the economic shock created by COVID-19, 3 sources are identified. Firstly, we have the purely medical shock where workers are sick and absent from work and unable to contribute to GDP. This causes a supply shock. Secondly, we have the economic impact of social distancing measures such as workplace closures, factory closures, travel restrictions, and quarantine. And this leads to both a supply and demand shock. And thirdly, there's a very real psychological or belief-based economic shock where a lot of attention is not paid. Households and firms tend to embrace a wait-and-see attitude when faced with massive uncertainty of the unknown unknowns of the type of which COVID-19 is presently presenting itself. Now, what are the economic transmission channels we face from these shocks? We face disruptions to trade in goods and services, supply chains, value chains, commodity prices, tourism and travel, remittances, foreign direct investment, and development finance. Now, to understand the economic impact of COVID-19, we need to recognize what was happening to the world pre-COVID-19. So what was happening pre-COVID-19? The economic performance of the world economy was already poor before the COVID-19 pandemic. The average global growth rate was 2.8% for the period 2011 to 2019 versus 3.4% for the period 1997 to 2006. Now, in 2019, the global economy recorded its worst performance since 2009 with a growth rate of just 2.5%. Even before the pandemic, we saw global GDP growth projections for 2020 had already been revised downwards. Looking at the Caribbean economy pre-COVID-19 was characterized by low growth, high debt, high trade openness, and low investment with a strong dependence on foreign aid and foreign direct investment. These characteristics make the region highly vulnerable to the economic impact of COVID-19. The IMF predicts that growth in the region would contract by 6.2% in 2020, which is expected to be the deepest recession in more than half a century. ECLAC recently produced its Caribbean Outlook, and it shows that the region will face a decline in GDP by 5.4% in 2020, or 7.9% if we do not take Guyana into account, while the Eastern Caribbean countries will contract by as much as 12 to 20% in 2020. Now, what would our future growth scenario look like post-COVID-19? Now, there's high uncertainty to know at this point, but what we do know is that 4 potential scenarios can play out. Firstly, we could have a steep contraction followed by a steep recovery as shown by a V-shaped growth curve, and this is our best case scenario. Secondly, we could have a steep contraction followed by a steep recovery, followed again by a steep contraction as shown by a W-shaped growth curve. Thirdly, we could face a prolonged steep contraction followed by a slow recovery as shown by a U-shaped growth curve. And fourthly, our worst case scenario is a steep contraction followed by a situation of no growth as shown by an L-shaped growth curve. So the question therefore is, how do we recover and what would a new lasting recovery look like? Now, today, as we face COVID-19 has created high levels of unemployment, a period of uncertainty and reflection, and COVID-19 has exposed inequality, and vulnerable populations in our society. This is similar to the time of Lewis's writings back in the 1930s, where we saw high unemployment levels in the Caribbean and labor riots. Now, according to ECLAC's Caribbean Outlook 2020, the region needs an industrial policy that is embedded in its post-pandemic development plans and policies, which synergizes with trade and macroeconomic policies to drive resilient growth. Now, this is similar to the development strategy outlined by Lewis back in the 1930s, which would have emphasized markets, resource availability, and economic policy. The Caribbean is heavily dependent on commodity exports and tourism, and these are two sectors which have been adversely affected by the pandemic. Now, the pandemic presents an opportunity, if not a necessity, for us in the region to produce a new coherent strategy of socioeconomic development for the Caribbean. Caribbean countries find themselves creating post-COVID-19 economic development plans. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the Prime Minister on the 16th of April appointed a high-level multi-sectoral committee comprised of representatives from government, private sector, civil society, labor, and academia with the mandate to develop a plan for reopening our society, and the roadmap for Trinidad and Tobago post-COVID-19 pandemic was formed. Now, the roadmap is intended to guide the government's actions in the immediate short term to cope with the fallout from the pandemic, as well as transform the economy and accelerate sustained development in the society over the medium to long term. And the roadmap includes numerous fiscal and trade incentives as a means to increasing growth and development. Again, very similar to the type that Lewis would have identified. Now, in my closing slide, I would just emphasize some of the specific strategies Lewis would have identified and how these strategies relate to us today. So Lewis emphasized the need to focus on the international export market with an emphasis on international niche marketing, and where relevant, regional integration should support the export drive to form regional industries. Lewis also emphasized that since exports was vital for industrial development, small developing countries need to pursue policy measures which would make their products internationally competitive. Lewis was also of the view that industrial enterprises should seek to utilize local resources where possible and create backward and forward linkages with other sectors of the economy. Now, relating all of this with what we face today, according to ECLAC's Caribbean Outlook, the decline in international trade brought about by COVID-19 increased protectionism and means that in the Caribbean, there's a need to support a trade recovery in the short term and explore new opportunities in the long term. The region must seek to harness the potential of emerging areas of comparative advantage and facilitate increased value chain participation. Trade based on industrial policy should benefit from economic restructuring, which promotes export diversification and upgrading of traditional sectors, thereby enabling the region to participate in global value chains. Now, the report outlines areas for upgrading in the Caribbean tourism sector as well in the commodity markets. In the Caribbean tourism sector, millennials and Generation Z demand for international travel is expected to rebound first after the pandemic. Now, these groups demand authentic, immersive, and adventurous experiences facilitated by mobile technology. The Caribbean tourism product therefore needs to better be tailored to suit this segment of the market by providing adventure tours and individual and small group immersive experiences that include COVID-19 measures to provide high value for money. Now, the other market segment is the high net wealth individuals or ultra high net wealth individuals. Now, international travel of these persons is also likely to resume quickly after the pandemic, since physical distancing requirements can be met on planes and yachts, and these persons have a lot more wealth to undertake travel. Now, this is a very highly specialized premium segment which requires attracting very high-end hotels and other facilities and a marked improvement in heritage and other sites, the emphasis should be on excellent service, personalized, customized attention, and exclusivity. Now, looking at some of the commodity exports for the region, given their vulnerability to price and demand shocks, there's a strong argument favoring diversifying and expanding exports in existing and emerging areas of comparative advantage in the region. Now, the regional outlook of trade based on industrial policy should benefit from economic restructuring, which promotes export diversification and again, upgrading of traditional sectors, thereby allowing the Caribbean to participate in regional global value chains. Caribbean countries generally have a comparative advantage in energy and petrochemical products and in some agricultural products. Now, in particular, we have an advantage for sugar, beverages, fish, cereal, fruits and vegetables, and wood products. And some potential market segments that we can upgrade into include food and beverages, cosmetics, cleaning products, and light manufacturing. Now, Lewis was also of the view that the state or the government has an important role to play in the industrial development process via the design and implementation of appropriate policy measures and the establishment of institutional framework and infrastructure needed to facilitate the industrialization process. In the region, we face structural gaps in infrastructure, ICT, and technical capacity, and all of these would have limited the Caribbean's competitiveness. Now, these factors also constrain CARICOM efforts at production integration, owing to the absence of key regional public goods. Modernizing these key economic infrastructure by the government, for instance, maritime and air transport, renewable energy, and ICT will bridge these gaps and foster greater engagement in regional and global value chains. And I'd like to end with a final point that according to Lewis, where there are high levels of unemployment, industrial policy should be designed to provide direct and indirect employment opportunities. Caribbean countries should engage in human resource development and training to match the technological changes and shifts in remote working taking place globally brought about by COVID-19. Now, this is essential to save jobs, create new jobs, and make people more employable. Also, we must bear in mind that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the jobs of women and youth, informal employment, and small and medium-sized enterprises. It is important to train persons in new skills to suit new jobs and entrepreneurship training and opportunities for the future, and these vulnerable groups should not be left behind. I thank you, that's my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for your presentation today. And I am up next. And the title of my presentation is the Arthur Lewis Eric Williams Schism, A Curse on Regional Unity. Let me share my screen. Right, and I'll go full screen. Right, so this is my presentation. So I'm looking at the Arthur Lewis Eric Williams Schism and asking the question whether it was a curse on regional unity. And a lot of my material is going to be based on secret and confidential documents between the colonial office and various officials in the West Indian federal government at the time, as well as other unit governments in the West Indies in the period just after the Jamaican referendum on federation, which was held on the 19th of September, 1961, and the period afterwards, leading up to the announcement by Trinidad and Tobago on the 14th of January, 1962, that it would withdraw from the federation. And I want to start by setting the table with an extract from a secret telegram to the Secretary of State for the Colonies from the acting Governor General of the West Indies, John Mordecai, on September 21st, 1961, which is just 2 days after the Jamaican referendum on the 19th of September, 1961. And it was labeled emergency, secret, and personal. So an extract from it is telling us that it is also relevant that Arthur Lewis, who is now in Trinidad, has seen both Prime Minister, meaning Sir Grantley Adams, and Premier, meaning Dr. Eric Williams, has been formally accepted by the former, meaning Sir Grantley Adams, as $1 a year representative to work here for the next 3 months to examine the prospect of salvage proposals. It is a good sign that Williams, while still non-committal personally, welcomes this arrangement. So it was quite clear that, that in respect of the arrangements that were being made, Arthur Lewis, who was the principal of the University College of the West Indies, had made an arrangement with Sir Grantley Adams to become a special advisor to Adams. And this particular communication from the acting Governor General. The Governor General was Lord Hales, who was on vacation in Scotland at the time, and John Mordecai was acting. And he's just reporting on what was happening here. But I'm just trying to set the table to show how Lewis comes into the federal discussion, and Williams is there already as a premier. And Grantley Adams, as the Prime Minister of the Federation, is having Arthur Lewis as his special advisor for the princely sum of $1 per year. Now, the response in London, of course, is that the colonial secretary at the time, Ian MacLeod, we convened a committee to discuss the future of the Federation after the Jamaican referendum. What had happened in Jamaica on the 19th of September, from the internal documentation that we've seen, threw the cat literally among the pigeons. No one really expected that Jamaica would have voted the way that it did. And having voted that way, the colonial office responded and they set up a committee. So on the 26th of September, 1 week after the Jamaican referendum on the 19th, a committee was convened in London to discuss issues. Now, minutes 4 and 7 from the minutes of that meeting have interested me because they are reporting on the views of Lewis in respect of Williams. So minute 4 says, Professor Lewis said Dr. Williams was fundamentally a federationist, though at present he was undecided as to what he should do. His inclination was to destroy the existing federation and wait for the small islands to appeal to him in a year or two to help them reconstruct a new federation. He agreed that Dr. Williams would like to go through the election. Trinidad and Tobago was having a general election at that time, which was due on the 4th of December. Would like to go through the election saying nothing. It should be borne in mind that the opposition was just as divided. The opposition in Trinidad, being the Democratic Labour Party, was just as divided on the federal issue as the PNM, the People's National Movement, the party of Eric Williams. What was needed now was 3 months, during which no statements were made by anybody. If this could be managed, it was perhaps possible to save the federation. So what was happening is that the committee was forming this view that they wanted some silence. Minute 7 says, Professor Lewis said an early independence date for Jamaica would upset the Trinidad apple cart. Consequently, it was desirable to postpone the announcement of the Jamaican date. Mr. Manley understood the position, this is Norman Manley, understood the position and would be sympathetic. He might suggest or agree that all West Indian independence dates be synchronized on the same day. On the other hand, Jamaica had voted against federation, and it would put Mr. Manley in great difficulty if formal defederation could not be carried out quickly. It would then be necessary to disentangle the consequential problems at leisure. So what was happening is that Jamaica had voted firmly to secede from the federation and to proceed to its own independence. And that meant that of the 10 countries in the federation, Jamaica was going to go its own way by virtue of its own act of self-determination by way of a referendum. The other 9 territories now, a strategy had to be worked out as to how they were going to continue in some form of federation without Jamaica. And this is where Arthur Lewis came into the picture. But the politics of the situation required also an engagement with Eric Williams. Now, Eric Williams held a press conference on the 8th of October, 1961 in Port of Spain. And the colonial government intelligence sources monitored the press conference to report back to the colonial office. So some of the excerpts that were sent by the colonial intelligence sources here in Trinidad and what they sent back to London, this excerpt caught my eye. So there was a question from The Guardian, according to the report, the Guardian, Trinidad Guardian newspaper. Has the Premier been asked to receive Professor Arthur Lewis? Does he propose to do so? And Dr. Williams's response is quite interesting. Well, the point is this Professor Arthur Lewis is an old friend of the Premier, is not a professor and is not the Premier when they meet. And Arthur Lewis is free to meet the Premier at any time. In fact, he was asked by Professor Arthur Lewis to receive Professor Arthur Lewis, and he did so before the professor went to England. We met twice, and I've met him again. Our relations are such that he's free to come in to see me at any time without notice to discuss any subject. Because when we discuss any subject at all, we bear in mind that there are sometimes larger considerations than the immediate political considerations. We bear in mind that we are perhaps making history one way or the other. Now, Mr. Espinay, who was with The Guardian at the time, asked a specific question. We are thinking in terms of his position as advisor to the Prime Minister, meaning Sir Grantley Adams, Prime Minister of the Federation. So Dr. Williams replies, I can't say anything. It doesn't cost Trinidad much. His advice, he's $1 a year man. I would like to get some $1 a year men for Trinidad. Trinidad only pays 38% of his salary. Trinidad was paying 38% of the federal budget. Trinidad only pays 38% of his salary. It costs us 38 cents. We don't mind that at all. We don't tell the federal government whom they should appoint as advisors. What you want to know is whether he has discussed federation with me. He has. He's an advisor on federation, so he would raise the point and you would want to know what I told him. I told him I wasn't free to discuss federation, etc. But we made no effort to stop him, his discussions. Any proposal that Professor Lewis makes to me or to the government of Trinidad and Tobago is given careful consideration. So Williams was in a very kind of semi-humorous, semi-sarcastic kind of mood, talking about relations with Sir Arthur Lewis, with Professor Arthur Lewis at the time. And this is what the nature of the discourse was. And that came out from it. So that clearly there was a kind of a pseudo tension building between the two of them, as you can see from the report. So, and I should mention that was the 8th of October, 1961. And the following day, the 9th of October, the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan reshuffled his cabinet. And Ian MacLeod was moved as Colonial Secretary and replaced by Reginald Maudling, who took over as Secretary of State for the Colonies on the 9th of October. On the 11th of October, John Mordecai, who was still acting as Governor General of the West Indies, sent a secret and personal letter to Ambler Thomas, who was a senior civil servant at the Colonial Office in London. And paragraph 10 in the letter says, the more substantial danger as we see it, and this is an angle already identifiable in his war of nerves movements, is of Williams being able to avoid having to declare a position at all on the argument that continuation of the present federation after Jamaica's withdrawal is dissolved by Jamaica and Her Majesty's government between them. The psychological advantage of this approach is obvious. He has already said publicly that by his mathematics, if you take away 1 from 10, you leave 0, not 9. In his private discussions with Arthur Lewis, he has maintained that on the basis of his legal advice, the present federation stands destroyed the moment Jamaica's secession is effected. He appears so firmly wedded to this view that in certain instances, he acts almost as if it were already destroyed. Now, it was clear that Williams wanted the federation completely destroyed and then to have something afterwards. And this appeared to be the position, but Williams was not taking a public position with regard to the future of the federation. And then there was these encounters between himself and Arthur Lewis behind the scenes. And Lewis was there as special advisor to the federal Prime Minister, Sir Grantley Adams. So this is what was emerging. Now, on his last day in office as acting Governor General of the West Indies, John Mordecai sent out a confidential circular saving grant dated the 16th of October, 1961 to federal governors and administrators, excluding Jamaica, in which he said, inter alia, paragraph 2, the Prime Minister's special personal advisor, Dr. Arthur Lewis, is now engaged in discussions in the territories of the Eastern Caribbean with a view to facilitating the formulation of proposals for the future that can, it is hoped, be welded into one common policy for presentation to Her Majesty's government as early in 1962 as is feasible. Clearly, a conference of West Indian leaders would be desirable before meaningful discussions can take place with Her Majesty's government. The timing of such a conference will depend on the speed with which territorial governments formulate their own ideas for the future, and on the convenience of those governments, some of whom will necessarily be preoccupied with territorial elections in the immediate future. There were 2 elections going on. For the 4th of December, 1961. Trinidad and Tobago was having a general election on the 4th of December, 1961, and Barbados was also having a general election on the 4th of December, 1961. So Mordecai is more or less wrapping up with a synopsis of things on his last day in office as acting Governor General, as Lord Hales was expected to be in office from the 17th of October. Now, Hales is back in office after the 17th of October. So in a personal letter from him, Lord Hales, to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Reginald Maudling, the new Secretary of State for the Colonies, dated the 21st of October, 1961. This is what Hales is saying. Later, I do trust you will be able to pay a visit. Ho Choi, now Ho Choi here is Sir Solomon Ho Choi, who is the governor of Trinidad and Tobago at this time. Ho Choi feels this could hardly be until the Trinidad elections are over. But the fact remains, knowing Williams, that a real clearance with him will not be possible until you have met, meaning you, the Secretary of State, have met with Williams. I hope I have not been laying down the law too much. I shall be writing to the office about general matters next week, but there is little to add for the moment to Mordecai's excellent letter to Thomas of the 11th of October, which I just read, or an excerpt of which I just read. Now, at this point on the letter, the actual correspondence, from what I've seen, the full stop is handwritten into a comma, and the sentence is continued in handwriting as follows. And I doubt if these will be until Arthur Lewis's return from his tour of the territories at the beginning of November. So that is written in handwriting by Hales. So the continuation of the letter in his personal handwriting before he sent it off obviously eluded the typist and was effectively converted into a very personal note, which obviously dealt with a very sensitive issue about Lewis's tour and the tactics around that. And obviously the letter became leak-proof by virtue of this approach to that last piece of the sentence. Now, Lewis completed his tour of the 9 territories of the Federation, and in a secret and personal letter to Ambler Thomas at the Colonial Office, dated the 4th of November, 1961, Lord Hales said inter alia, Arthur Lewis has just returned from what seems to have been a very successful tour of the 8 territories. The long and short of what he tells me is that all these territories are anxious for a continuation of a federation of 9, are prepared to make certain sacrifices of sovereignty, regard Trinidad as their natural leader and the seat of federation, and in fact seem to have generally accepted the principles of Williams's Economics of Nationhood. Eric Williams had written a booklet entitled Economics of Nationhood, so that the principles of that appear to be what everyone seems to be on board with. So far, and this is, he's talking about Lewis now, so far he has written a long and masterly report in the form of a letter on the subject to Williams, 18 pages of foolscap with appendices. And during this weekend in Tobago, we'll draft a report for Adams, which will be an expurgated edition of his letter to Williams. So Lewis wrote to Williams first before he sent his report to Adams. Yesterday, Williams asked Lewis to lunch, and they discussed his letter. Lewis spoke to me on the telephone afterwards on his way to Tobago, and he will come and see me on Monday and give me a fuller report. However, it appears that Williams was not at all bad on principles. That is, he wants a federation to continue if possible. He's quite against a referendum on the subject in Trinidad. So Williams did not want a referendum in Trinidad on the issue of staying in the federation, but made it quite clear that he is determined to smash this federation first. So Williams was determined, he wanted to smash that federation up and then start again, as he refuses to have any dealings or sit around a conference table with Adams or any of his bunch. I fully expected this, but Lewis, who is not a politician, was very shocked by Williams's vehemence on this point. So Lewis simply could not understand why Williams had so much vitriol for the Federation and had no desire to have any meeting with Sir Grantley Adams, none whatsoever. And Lewis simply couldn't understand it. And what Hales is telling the colonial secretary is that, you know, Lewis is not a politician, and he was very shocked by Williams's vehemence on this point. So Williams is running a two-track strategy. One was, privately, he wanted to destroy the Federation and start over on his terms. And with Lewis, he was walking a kind of diplomatic tightrope. And Lewis just couldn't see it. So when Williams eventually erupted on the issue, he was blindsided. He couldn't understand Williams's vehemence on this point. So Lewis met 4 times with Eric Williams on the 22nd of September, that's 3 days after the Jamaican referendum, the 6th of October, the 3rd of November, and the 8th of November. Lewis delivered his report to the Prime Minister of the West Indies, Sir Grantley Adams, on the 9th of November, 1961. It was attached to Lord Hales's secret and personal letter to Reginald Maudling, the Colonial Secretary, of the 10th of November. Now, the last 5 paragraphs of Lewis's report read as follows. Paragraph 41. I've had a number of talks with the Premier of Trinidad and Tobago, who has seen a draft of these proposals. 42. As he has stated publicly, he takes the position that the existing federation will come to an end when the British Parliament enacts the secession of Jamaica. 43. It is my impression that he desires that Trinidad and Tobago and the other islands should enter into a new association, rather than that Trinidad and Tobago should seek independence on its own. However, he is not prepared to enter into any commitment at this time. 44. I have reason to believe that he is willing to attend a conference to discuss the details of such an association, but I do not know whether the proposals made here will be acceptable to him. So Lewis is pretty much in the dark with regard to what he has recommended to the federal government. The Premier, meaning Williams, is not at this time willing to name a date for a conference. So Williams is not saying anything, and they're not getting anything from him, and he's not fixing a date for a conference to discuss the future of the Federation. Now, by the 1st of December, 1961, the desirability of having Lewis around in January, when the Colonial Secretary, Reginald Maudling, was in Trinidad, was beginning to wane. So Hugh Fraser, who is the junior Colonial Office Minister, began making arrangements for Maudling's visit to the West Indies. Now, this is going on at a time when the Secretary of State was in East Africa, making other arrangements for other events in East Africa. And Hugh Fraser, who was the Colonial Office Minister under the Secretary of State at the time, was making all the arrangements back in London. And he was trying to make the arrangements for Maudling's visit to the West Indies. Now, this is reflected in an immediate secret and personal telegram to Hugh Fraser from Lord Hales in the West Indies, dated the 1st of December, 1961, in which Hales is saying, paragraph 6, your paragraph 6, Lewis's visit to Trinidad. The point of my remarks in paragraph 5 of my telegram, personal number 257, was that while Lewis may be here on genuine university business, his presence here could be misunderstood. Ho Choi, meaning Sir Solomon Ho Choi, the governor of Trinidad and Tobago, also writes, quote, whether Lewis is here or not makes no serious difference, although I still hold that it would be better if he was not, meaning until sent for. I agree. So Lord Hales now agrees that Lewis shouldn't be around. Sol Ho Choi, who is the governor and obviously in close contact with Williams, is saying we don't want Lewis around. And the Colonial Office is now trying to process the cold shoulder into sourcing Lewis's views and to finding out certain things, as you will see when I come to what Hugh Fraser had to write when he wrote to Lewis subsequent to this. Your paragraph 7, I consulted Adams before sending Lewis's report to you. No doubt Adams will say that he likes the report, but I expect he may well regret having accepted Lewis's offer in the first place, in view of its findings, which will now suit his own designs for a so-called Federation of 8. It was apparent that Sir Solomon Ho Choi, the governor of Trinidad and Tobago, had scuttled the idea of Lewis coming to Trinidad when the Colonial Secretary Reginald Maudling was there, and this marked a turning point in the advance of the Lewis plan for a Federation of 9 that would have included Trinidad and Tobago. So on the 16th of December, 1961, Lord Hales reports to the Colonial Secretary on a meeting he had with Eric Williams And it was obvious that he, Williams, had other plans. And this was clearly brewing in advance of the Colonial Secretary's visit in January of 1962. So Hales now reports as follows, and this is an excerpt. After discussing with Ho Choi, the governor of Trinidad and Tobago, I saw Williams for an hour this morning and made the points set out in paragraph 3 of your personal number 385. He listened in silence and then started on a monologue in which nearly everyone came in for castigation. I shall be sending you an account of this conversation in detail by the next bag, though most of it is not new. Meanwhile, this is simply to say that it is certainly not, repeat not, now necessary for you to send a special message to him. They were contemplating sending Williams a special message on his election victory on the 4th of December. Now he's telling the Secretary of State, don't worry with the special message after what I heard this morning. He said on parting that he had not replied to you, meaning the Secretary of State, as it did not seem an answer was required. I did get over the point that you hoped that he would not feel it necessary to make public statements on matters affecting the future. He said that he would of course not be doing so because matters of policy were decided by the party and their convention would not meet until 20th January. For the same reason, he would not be able to commit himself to you. I am sure it was a good thing to have seen him. So they realized now that Williams had shifted the goalposts. He didn't want a referendum. He was going to use the party, the People's National Movement, as his vehicle for communicating the change using the party convention, which he said was not meeting until the 20th of January. And therefore, Hales is now saying, well, maybe it was a good thing I spoke to him this morning because now I found out exactly where his head is at. So on the 2nd of January, 1962, Arthur Lewis, then principal of the University College of the West Indies, wrote to Hugh Fraser, then UK Colonial Office Minister, to respond to Fraser's letter of the 14th of December, 1961. And to this further, Fraser addressed the future of the West Indian Federation further to the Jamaican referendum on the subject on 19 September 1961, and the revised plan for a federation of 9 members without Jamaica submitted by Lewis to the federal Prime Minister, Sir Grantley Adams, in November 1961. The relevant paragraph in Fraser's letter to which Lewis responded was, at this distance, it is very difficult to see precisely how the hand should be played, but our thoughts, that is to say, your thoughts and mine, or mine, shall we say, as influenced by our meeting, remain the chief premise of our considerations. If, however, following your visit to Barbados and your reported visit with the new Premier to Eric, you have any new ideas, I'd be very happy to hear them. That is the extract from the letter that Fraser wrote to Lewis on the 14th of December, 1961. So, in a reply written on the letterhead, and I have the letter here in front of me, it's a 2-page letter, written on the letterhead of the University College of the West Indies, the predecessor of the UWI, and titled Secret. Arthur Lewis replied to Hugh Fraser and signed the letter as principal. And he started off by saying that he would be in Trinidad from January 13th to 24th, and that he would see V.C. Bird in Antigua and the newly elected Premier of Barbados, Errol Barrow, on his way down from Jamaica. He also confessed to not seeing Eric Williams, quote, since the beginning of November, unquote. He offered the following analysis of Williams's speeches between the time he last saw Williams and what he had read subsequently after the general election in Trinidad and Tobago on the 4th of December, 1961. Lewis concluded the following about Williams and the Federation. 1, he would prefer association with other territories to going it alone, but will go alone if he does not get his terms. So this is Lewis now analyzing Williams. So he says Williams is going to go it alone if he doesn't get his terms. Association does not mean federation. It means a unitary state with the other territories having the same status as Tobago. He knows that this will not be acceptable to all the other territories. He would be content to have Grenada and St. Vincent come in alone, St. Lucia and Dominica too, if they so desire. He will probably ask for a dowry as the price of taking any of the smaller islands into association, and will probably refuse if there is no dowry. So if Williams didn't get the lump sum that he was looking for, he most probably would refuse. Lewis had now formed the view that Williams was not in favor of a continuation of the Federation. with 9 territories after Jamaica seceded, but rather that Williams wanted a unitary state, not a federation, a unitary state, with a selected few territories having the status of Tobago in that unitary state. Lewis arrived at the following conclusion, having painted his impression of Williams's views for Fraser as follows, quote, "My reaction to this will be to let Trinidad go it alone and establish the other islands of the Federation centered on Barbados. There could then be organized a sort of East Africa High Commission, whose membership would be British Guyana, who was not a member of the Federation at the time, Trinidad, Eastern Caribbean, and Jamaica. This commission would take over the airline, shipping, meteorology, university, etc. External representation could be joint in some places, example, Ottawa, while having to be separate in others, example, London and the UN." So Lewis was now saying, let Williams go. His mindset on Williams had changed, and he was now going actively behind a federation without Trinidad and Tobago. So even before Trinidad and Tobago had announced that it was going to withdraw, Lewis was telling Colonial Office Minister Hugh Fraser back in London, let Williams go. And he did so on a letterhead, that a 3-page letter, sorry, I told you 2, it was 3, written on University College of the West Indies paper and signed, yours sincerely, W.A. Lewis, Principal. And it was secret. Now, Lewis gave Fraser his reasons for this line of thinking as follows. 1, association on Dr. Williams's terms may be acceptable to 2 or 3 of the islands, but is not acceptable to all. And even those 2 or 3 would probably prefer federation with Barbados, since the prospect of dictatorship by Williams is not relished. 2, it is not desirable to reduce all the other islands to the status of Tobagos. The history of Tobagos in the West Indies, including Nevis, the Grenadines, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, Caymans, is one of neglect. I agree strongly with V.C. Bird that any island without a government of its own is doomed to neglect. End of quote. So Lewis was attempting to protect the smaller territories of the Eastern Caribbean while simultaneously trying to find a way to keep the larger territories in a different kind of union. On the 14th of January, 1962, Trinidad and Tobago announced its withdrawal from the Federation. There was a resolution adopted by the General Council of the People's National Movement that put out that Trinidad and Tobago was going to withdraw from the Federation. This ties back in with what Williams was saying before about the party being the being that would influence policy. And although the convention was carried for the 28th of January 1962, the General Council met on the 14th of January 1962 and passed a resolution which obviously would go on to the convention for ratification. So the announcement came via the General Council resolution on the 14th of January 1962. So Trinidad and Tobago signaled it was gone from the Federation. Both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago were now going to be gone. And regional unity was never going to be the same again. The Federation ended in 1962. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago proceeded to their independence in 1962. And all future attempts at federation in the West Indies have been unsuccessful, and meaningful regional unity in some other form remains elusive. It is almost as if regional unity were cursed by the Lewis-Williams schism, because there has never been an adequate recovery since all of this, since the dismantling of the federation that existed at the time. And the behind the scenes machinations that went on with regard to this, as between the tensions between Lewis and Williams, really paint the picture of how the whole thing just descended. And it crashed and burned, literally. Federation was over in 1962. And the concept of individual national independence came to the fore. That has happened. Now there have been all kinds of attempts at all kinds of other regional unity type efforts, but we really have not ever gotten back to what was originally intended at the time. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, and let me come out of my screen sharing And I would like now to invite my colleague, Dr. Don Marshall, who is the director of SALISES at the Cave Hill campus in Barbados. His topic is Beyond Linear Concepts of Development, Building Post-COVID Caribbean Sustainable Futures. Dr. Marshall, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Hamid, and welcome and thanks again for having me join this esteemed panel to share some of my early thoughts about post-COVID futures. I am seeking now to share my screen, and I hope that I can do so with some relative ease. Let's see, do I have it here? Yes, I think I do. And I'll want to begin from the first slide. So I do hope that, Hamid, you can see everything that I have here.
Yes, seeing it very clear.
Right. Okay, so yes, for those viewing here and for those that are listening and those in internet land, good evening again, good afternoon again. We've reached a particular point in our development where it is fair to say that ever since the COVID moment, much of what we understand to be orthodox development theorizing, orthodox development policy, and so on, it has reached kind of a crisis point. In some cases, we are persisting with dead ends, and there is still the growth for new futures based on premises and best practices that have become upended in light of the changed global, regional, and local circumstance, again, linked to COVID. But by linear concepts of development, I want to establish clearly what I mean. Normally, when people speak about their own sense of well-being, as well as their sense of a country's development, the notion is that you're seeking to reach one particular, you're trying to improve one's circumstances to the point where you say, I want to live better, or I want my country to achieve a higher level of accumulation and growth. And that this is kind of a linear thinking. And I want to suggest to you that within the Caribbean context, that's kind of problematic given our historical and institutional starting points. We came out of a plantation and a colonial experience. And therefore, the question is not so much about living better or achieving greater levels of economic growth in any linear sense, but it's about restoring balance and actualizing what freedom truly means. So it means that I am closer to the ideal Amartya Sen expressed in the view about development as freedom, and that development ought to be about freedom and the advance of freedoms. And but I am more theoretically grounded and inspired by that critical Caribbean traditional scholarship that look for decolonial forms of development that sort of resisted some of the notions about development based on theorizing coming from the West. So I might have said a mouthful there, but what I'm really saying is that there's been a anti-colonial currency of ideas and thoughts coming out of the Caribbean tradition of resistance to colonization and resistance to neo-colonial development. And I am referring to scholars like Norman Gervins, George Hall, George Beckford, Franz Fanon, Sierra James, Sylvia Winter, Lloyd Bess, Harry Beckles, and so on, up to recent scholars, Eugene Bartow, Pat Mohammed, Rolla Reddock, Aaron Kamagisha, I would like to think I've been writing in this tradition as well, but basically, we are all inspired, and as much as we draw from current projects, movements, if you look at what was happening in the 60s and 70s, the intellectual class was inspired by as much as it gave inspiration to ideas around new international economic order. The Rastafarian movement, that was about the greater sense of identity and what it means to be a Caribbean Black person. And we also know that the rich scholarship emanating from the studies on women and development that started in the then Institute of Socioeconomic Research, we are now called SALISES, but in our former incarnation, we were the Institute of Socioeconomic Research. And back in the 1970s, early 80s, there was a major research done on women and development. And from that, you had an interrogation of patriarchy, of male dominance, of societies that ignore the contribution of women. And basically the whole question of conceptualizing development that would be one geared towards addressing poverty, addressing relations of power across gender, and so on, addressing the race and ethnic question. These became the central preoccupation of many scholars in the Caribbean tradition. So I want to join in that effort to resist colonialism, racism, gender discrimination, and so on, and to treat all this as derivatives of a particular form of capitalist exploitation, a particular form of capitalist development that takes its expression today in the form of the neoliberal model of development that basically is about the ideas around fashioning development policy that would see the private sector become the main engine of growth, and that would see the need to foment industrial transformation through foreign investment strictly. So basically that the state should play a role as regulator, that it, apart from a few public goods, it should limit itself to fashioning policies that are in the direction of facilitating business and facilitating fair trade among private sector actors and the rest of it. Now,
Don, can you put on your video? Can you put on your video?
Okay, all right. Forgive me. All right. Are you indicating that my video is on? Are you suggesting that the?
No, we're seeing it now. We're seeing your video, and
right.
And
okay,
you want
so
to share your screen as well.
Okay. Is my screen shared?
No, you can share it.
Okay. And
right, and then you can got it.
Right. So I don't know if you can see me, but you can certainly see my screen.
Yes.
You can
see you and the screen.
All right, great. All right. So one of my essential, I've said a mouthful, but just focus on the essential premise here is that I'm trying to offer a critique of actually existing neoliberalism in the Caribbean and what a decolonial future tapped onto goals of sustainable development can look like. It emerges as a response drawn against the backdrop of interacting and converging crises facing Caribbean small states. And I started to list some of these crises, and I think it is important to not list them as sequential or any sense. It's to capture the sense instead of them being interacting and converging. Now, Preeya would have done well to set the context for establishing that pre-COVID, Caribbean economies were experiencing low growth and we're still continuing to reel from the shocks of the global recession that started about 2008, 2009. So we've had like 10 years of austerity neoliberal austerity, and globally, the global recession was followed up by a not so great global recovery. Again, the reference to growth rates being under 3% globally, averaging about 2.5%, suggests that the pre-2008 period was a period of high global economic growth. The period after the recession was met with the new normal of around 2 to 2.5%, and in regions like ours, with limited exports, etc., we experience low to no growth in the region, and that has been a legacy coming out of the austerity period, say global between 2009 to 2020. Then we entered into a period of well, we know now as the pandemic. And this is, in many ways, has thrown new challenges about the way forward. Now, I wanted to also capture one of the things that I didn't focus on is, but I've listed here, is the shifts in global power stakes and transitions. I don't think many orthodox development specialists do focus on the importance of geopolitics in their equations. So I normally would want to suggest to you that no country develops outside of a permissive world development context. You don't achieve sustainable levels of growth and stable trade, etc., outside of a permissive world context. So it's important to note that one of the crises that continue to face the world today is the absence of clear leadership. I mean, we've had the transition from Trump, but at the same time, we must recognize that among core leading powers, the competition or rivalry among them for the capacity to influence and shape the rules of the international political economy continues to heat up. China presents new challenges to the Anglo-American order that we've hitherto experienced. We still have economists that are rooted in paradigms that speak about the need for countries, if they must access finance for development, the need for them to borrow in the traditional sense, that is to say, either from the IMF or to seek to raise funds on the capitals market. And reliance on the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions that form the Paris Club, or reliance on the capital markets bring either expense, increasing market volatility. I say expense, I mean expensive loans, and they're also, and these loans themselves, the structures of these loans themselves are subject to volatile market conditions. So you can have an economic shock occurring in international financial markets that might see that might reverberate negatively for countries that are trying to meet their debt commitments to bondholders and hedge fund operators. And if you are borrowing from the IMF, where the cost of those loans are extremely cheap, you're faced with a phalanx of demands that have to be met that represent a trespass into your public policy. So one of the casualties of that is that, well, two casualties. One, you don't have the public policy scope to maneuver and shape your goals as you wish. And two, you can't fashion an industrial policy at the same time that you are a signatory to the International Monetary Fund, whether it's through the enhanced finance facility mechanism or any other of their programs, because the nature of the austerity demanded is one where they call for a reduced role of the state in the form of assisting in broad-based development, and more by way of state intervention to facilitate digitizing government making it easy for firms to establish business and the rest of it. Again, the central premise being that for countries in our region, we need to facilitate private sector enterprise and growth. Now, I've said that the notion that we have to rely on neoliberal models of development to go forward is a mistaken one because of the different institutional and historical starting points. So I would want to suggest one of the classic examples of that. One of the assumptions made in most of these westernized concepts is that there are markets ready and automatic and waiting only for the kiss of the correct policy measures by governments to see market growth and market development occur. The problem is the Caribbean is struck with a unique structural problem where we have not had a long history of middle class development. A middle class, of a senior middle class, will only emerge after the 1930s, well into the 1940s. So you don't have in 2021 middle classes, black and brown, and East Indian, well, to a large extent, black and brown middle classes with a long history of intergenerational wealth. So basically, the entrepreneurs that you're seeking to give life to, the entrepreneurship that is being recommended as a route to self-empowerment, a route to self-expression, a route to private sector development, is not necessarily open to many middle class, black and brown families, largely because they don't have that wealth to take the risks and will rely on debt financing, angel financing, or the state to assist in the pursuit of their entrepreneurial dreams. So the notion that you will organize a certain economy along neoliberal precepts based on entrepreneurial freedom and so on ought to be checked against the fact that the sociology and history of the region does not support that premise. So then therefore the question would be, how are you going to fashion development in the Caribbean if neoliberalism is not the path, or the neoliberal models are not the path to go? And you would have to then look at the question of decolonization and what that meant and the role of the state in pursuing development. So whatever model of development you have to contemplate, the state would have to play a leading role along with enlightened elements of the private sector and foreign capital. That is my recommendation. It is born out of the fact that the goals for the Caribbean, if you're talking about freedom as development and development as freedom, the goals for the Caribbean has to be to advance human dignity. And human dignity in the region was advanced through welfare state models and welfare state structures. And we know that with shifts in the nature of the global political economy, we've seen that with the decline of the Lomé Agreement and the end of the Cold War and a number of other developments, we've seen countries having to deal with balance of payments and crises in their public finances to the point that they cannot always support the extent of the welfare goods that they provided throughout most of the early years of independence. So the challenge has been to grow their economies and expand, and then to therefrom continue to support the welfare structures. We are at a point, however, with the crisis that we currently face, where the pandemic crisis, where we have an opportunity to refashion our development strategies. And it has to be about getting past the limited diversification that the previous models presented. So one, we have an opportunity to get past the limited diversification by contemplating wooing and attracting investment, as well as state making such investments in relation to three key areas: food and food security. This will be in the direction of reducing food imports. Two, in the area of medicine, we have the capacity and we ought to seek to exploit our biotechnology potential. That's to say our biomass, our flora, our fauna, our capacities to learn more about the biotechnology prospects and potentials of the region. And three, we can use biomass to create alternative energy. So we have a fuel bill, a food import bill, and bills related to the import of medicines and so on that can be addressed if we seek to dynamize the growth of these new areas, as well as exploit the potential in our culture and maritime. And this will call for the state within each country to play a more catalyzing role. And it will also call for a compatible industrial policy and a return to what Norbert Gervin would say, a regionalism that has purpose, a regionalism that is based on production integration and a settlement along the lines of food security that I speak when I speak of the need for reducing the food import bill. So there is a way in which we have to turn towards a more industrial policy. We must adopt an industrial policy at the national level, at the very least. Ideally, we would want a regionalized approach to economic recovery and renewal. And we must fashion new relationships with local capital and foreign capital. And I think this is very important. Earlier when I made mention of the fact that there are shifts in global power states and transitions, I think we should recognize that what China brings to the international system is the phenomenon known as patient lending. A number of its loans does feature long-term repayment schedules, one, and two, a number of the Chinese loans also feature a new principle in international lending based on no attempt to trespass in the public policy of the receiving country. So this is a variance from the World Bank, from the IMF, and from the Paris Club group, which is while they insist on conditionalities that represent severe curtailment of one's public policy, the Chinese lending, either via its state-owned enterprises, via its Export-Import Bank, via its Silk Route Fund, via the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, which rivals the World Bank now as a major lender to countries. None of these loans, none of these arrangements represent any attempt to, as it were, intervene in the public policy decisions of the regime, so engage with China and these different funding agencies. So that is an interesting development and an interesting principle that China brings to the global political economy. Of course, we should also recognize that the goal towards overcoming coloniality, a goal that we've been long pursuing in the region, is one where we have to continue to exercise vigilance in how we exercise our sovereignty and how we engage in new sovereignty bargains with the Chinese. So obviously the Chinese China joins other powers, sorry about that. When we speak about the international system, we're really talking about an inter-imperial world order, where United States, Britain, France, China, these core advanced industrialized countries, really in their relationships with other countries that we will refer to as the global south, engage in relationships that sees them, because of their history and because of their own institutional starting points, see them enjoying terms of trade and exchange that are more beneficial to them than it is to us. However, as Preeya indicated, there are a number of exports in food and beverages and other areas that we can continue to build on, and we can continue to enjoy in global value chains in order to improve our terms of trade. But if you're going to really, as it were, expand the capacity of that country to sustain itself, you must move beyond the sale of one or two exports and tourism towards a fuller diversification. And this is where bargains with creditor nations become very, very important. So we have some hard infrastructural constraints facing us in the area of regional transport. And there's a need for, as a region, to negotiate with the Chinese authorities, whether it's at the level of the state or state-owned enterprise or the AIIB, this is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the need for 2 or 3 ferries to run counterclockwise in the region to carry our goods and to carry our goods across the region, and one to carry our goods to newer markets, say in Western Africa, countries who enjoy our palate and with whom we have kinship and other kinds of relationships. We must diversify our relationships of trade and relationships of tourist travel away from a heavy reliance on those that we have inherited with independence. And so all this is part of the agenda I want to recommend going forward if you're thinking about new ways of fashioning development. I want to conclude by making a point, just drawing 2 points clearly out here. I want to talk about state posture very much at this point. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about the role for the state in a post-COVID future, or when shaping post-COVID futures. I don't think this can be underestimated. We need a new social charter of rights that should address the question of what freedoms would look like. And one such freedom that has to be addressed for a region faced with prior to the pandemic, high youth unemployment rates, would have to be the question of a right to employment. How this is actualized, how this is designed policy-wise is up for a wide variety of creativity. But basically, we have the capacity to know, to test, and to properly develop systems where no household should no household should be operating below a certain kind of basic income. And you could achieve a right to employment if it is expressed in terms of leaving no household behind. Now, the modern Caribbean household has to be one that can facilitate online learning It has to be able to facilitate access to government services. It has to be able to access the purchase of goods locally. One must be able to, rely on apps and so on to do to conduct one's normal business and to conduct economic life. And so the question then of what ought to be a basic income for a household of 3, 5, 7, and so on. These things can be measured statistically and determined. And the social chart of race should then speak to some kind of employment insurance or household insurance that takes care of, well, let's just say household income insurance. Because I think the way in which we should tackle poverty alleviation and tackle the associated questions of advancing human dignity should be based on looking at households and bringing them into the equation of how we see the economy and society, how we marry the economy and society. And finally, these new bargains in the international political economy that our states must fashion must not repeat the sins of the past. The CBI, those initiatives that relate to citizenship by investment, that amounts to selling sovereignty. I could explain that in the Q&A. This is something that should be abhorred because we are collectively engaging in a race to the bottom in the region when we seek to woo foreign investment through that means. And there's a need to approach the WTO with a view of testing its dispute settlements mechanisms and its many clauses that allow for exclusions once a region or country faces economic emergencies. COVID-19 represents an economic emergency, especially for service-oriented economies. We should not shy away from pursuing models of development that would see state subsidies being a part and parcel of the normal way of conducting one's public policy and one's industrial policy. So the new bargains to be had are not just with creditor nations, not just with campaigning for debt relief, but also exercising those clauses within the WTO structure that would give countries in the region the capacity to have the fiscal and public policy space to make sure that they can make sure that the state, along with enlightened elements of the private sector and foreign capital, can make the necessary investments in agriculture, in our biopotential, and in design manufacturing. Okay, I'll stop for now.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Marshall, for your presentation. And thanks. Right, so now we go to our fourth presenter today, who is Dr. Tyehimba Salandy, who is a fellow here at SALISES Augustine, and his topic is Sir Arthur Lewis, Knowledge Production and the Quest for Alternative Indigenous Development. Dr. Salandy, kindly proceed.
Thank you, Professor Ghany. So I'm honored to be able to share some thoughts on my topic, Sir Arthur Lewis, Knowledge Production and the Quest for Alternative Indigenous Development. And I want to start by talking about some of the development challenges facing the Caribbean. And of course, the first main one is that we are still dealing with a range of widespread social inequalities that more than 50 years on past independence, at least for most of us, a lot of the inequalities that has pervaded the social space, we are still very much dealing with much of this. We are also dealing with a range of pollutive, vulnerable, and unsustainable industries that are part of the region's subservient integration into global capitalism. The Caribbean also is entangled within global coloniality, and this is really shown through our subscription to a number of so-called global institutions whose mantra and words and framework speak to them being global institutions and speak to the principle of inclusion. But when you really get into the nitty-gritty of the origins of these institutions, who funds it, who are the directors who run it, These are institutions that have not been formed for the best interests of the Caribbean. They did not draw widely from participation of all countries of the world, but they are deeply ideological. Yet, for all intents and purposes, we have subscribed to these institutions as if they are global democratic institutions when they are far from. We also have the destruction of various natural habitats, spaces, and species, mostly through a subscription to models of development that put profits over people and the environment. And certainly these models of business have its roots in slavery and slave trade. The legacy of this has not really been addressed properly within the Caribbean region or even within the halls of global capitalism. Some of the debates in recent times on the topic of reparations is an important step in addressing the unequal origins of global capitalism. My interest this afternoon is really the significance of the life and times of Sir Arthur Lewis. So it is fitting that I start with a quote from him, where he said that the fundamental cure for poverty is not money, but knowledge. And I will revisit that quote in a little while. Sir Arthur Lewis was born in 1915, and he has been widely celebrated and lauded around the region and around the world for a number of firsts, including being one of the first Black professors at the London School of Economics. He was the principal of UWE, as well as he was one of the few Caribbean people to win a Nobel Prize. He is most known for his models of economic development, yet at the same time, his vision for Caribbean transformation has been widely criticized, especially by radical Caribbean thinkers who have expressed concerns about its implications for foreign domination of the Caribbean. So against this background of critiques, we have several notable Caribbean authors, including Tennyson Joseph and Norman Girvan, who have attempted to repair the image of Sir Arthur Lewis by trying to locate him within the historical context of his time. And I want to make a very bold statement here. And it's the fact that, in my view, the best of Sir Arthur Lewis is not the work that he was awarded a Nobel Prize for, not the work he was knighted for, not his ascension to positions of authority, but rather for his activism and work as a young man. And this is the legacy of Sir Arthur Lewis, which in my view is most worthy of celebration. As I mentioned, Sir Arthur Lewis was born in 1915 when almost all of the Caribbean was under colonial rule. And you had the circumstances of emancipation in the previous century. Yet the Caribbean working class was still faced with different issues of low wages, high unemployment, inadequate representation, and the arrogant racist attitudes of colonial administrators and employees. There also was a lack of established structures to resolve different industrial disputes. In his 1939 publication, Sir Arthur Lewis spoke about the emergence of this working class movement in the Caribbean. And he made a case for preferential trading arrangements when he said, "What claims have West Indians to demand such sacrifice from the British people?" Briefly this, it is the British who by their action in past centuries are responsible for the presence in these lands of the majority of their inhabitants, whose ancestors as slaves contributed millions to the wealth of Great Britain, a debt which the British have to repay. So here we have a young Sir Arthur Lewis in the aftermath of the labor uprisings of the 1930s, putting forward an argument that is quite similar to the arguments being put forward by adherents to the modern Caribbean reparations movement. Sir Arthur Lewis pointed clearly to the deep inequalities within the British West Indies, which he attributed to the legacy of West Indian slavery. He made very sharp critiques about the political structure of the colonies. He said there's a widespread impression that the governor and his officials are little more than tools of the white oligarchy of planters, merchants, and bankers, in whose society they spend most of their time and whose will it is that really governs these islands. And he goes on and he says that we have a problem which can only be solved by destroying its roots, the deliberate maintenance of white supremacy. So here we have a young Arthur Lewis making very sharp critiques against the colonial order and putting his finger on what he saw as being the root of the issues in the Caribbean at that time, which is white supremacy. Another area of the life and times of Sir Arthur Lewis that isn't often spoken about is his activism as a young man. And we see a strong degree of anti-colonialism coming forward in his involvement with the League of Colored Peoples, where he was an editor and writer in the Keys Journal in the 1930s. With Lewis playing a major role, this organization would have protested the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. They would have challenged the hiring practices of the British Colonial Office and exposed the racial inequalities of empire. Although Lewis would later on become known for his rather conservative views, it is as a writer for this Keys Journal that we see a passionate, polemic, and expressive Lewis intent on addressing different social injustices. So here Lewis clearly challenges the arrogance and racism of British Empire and connected it directly to the British Colonial Office. Lewis also wrote attacking the hiring and employment practices of the colonial offices, noting that some jobs were reserved for those with European parentage. And no doubt Lewis would have remembered his own childhood dream of wanting to become an engineer, but being blocked by colonial practices that didn't allow the hiring of Black engineers. Yet at the same time, it is important to note that the advocacy by Lewis was not really aimed at overturning empire, but more a reformist type change towards opening up opportunities for non-whites in the professional spheres and in the colonial establishment. And this would have led to him later accepting a job in the colonial office, an institution that his writings reveal he clearly understood as serving the interests of empire. One of the major contributions of Arthur Lewis is in terms of challenging what we can identify as being an international division of production that relegates the Caribbean to just being a mere producer of raw materials and thus having to import more finished products from the metropole. And we could relate this challenge to a global knowledge production system, where in spite of entrenched ideas about the Caribbean and its place, Arthur Lewis was able to put forward the ability and right of the Caribbean to industrialize if it wanted. And I want to go back to the quote that I opened with. The fundamental cure for poverty is not money, but knowledge. But again, we would have to ask ourselves, whose knowledge? Tedderson Joseph argues that Lewis's anti-colonialism was couched in terms of removing the internal structural defect of British control, which once removed would free local hands to pursue the appropriate and necessary economic approaches and strategies. He goes on to say that for Lewis, his anti-colonialism appears to stop at the point where British withdrawal begins. And his ideas have the quality of being less critical of the historical legacy of the colonial order than was preferred by his latter Caribbean intellectuals. And this really emphasizes the importance of the concept of coloniality, which emphasizes that the period of independence did not evaporate or erase the patterns of global colonial power relations, but they merely changed form. And thus, while Arthur Lewis was quite critical when faced with that overt and in-your-face manifestation of colonial power during the time of colonial rule, he was not able to challenge it as strongly when the Caribbean would have made a shift from colonialism to independence. And in some ways, we can see some contradictions between a young Arthur Lewis and an old Arthur Lewis. And this could be said that these contradictions could reflect the contradictions that exist in the Caribbean space, in that we have had both resistance and accommodation to the forces of power that have been present. According to Arthur Lewis, exterior events are secondary in understanding what is happening in the Caribbean. Yet, if we look at the majority of knowledge produced in the world, most of it does not come from the Caribbean. There's a certain degree of coloniality of knowledge where the majority of books, movies, cartoons, documentaries, journals, and all the body of information by which we know the world, the majority of it comes from persons within countries of the dominant North. And there is an excellent article that I would recommend from an author called Ramon Grosfagel, which is titled The Structure of Knowledge in Western Universities. And what Grosfagel examines is really the body of knowledge that powers the world didn't just come from 5 Euro-American countries, but it came from a limited set of persons, mostly white males in these 5 Euro-American countries. And the implication here is that while we may assume that the body of knowledge that we are conditioned in and know comes from a wide cross-section of the peoples of the world, this is not really so. So there are inherent biases within the production of knowledge that it is impossible to understand without getting into the geopolitics of knowledge, which in certain aspects and periods of Arthur Lewis's work, he didn't pay sufficient attention to. And this really brings us to the topic and the point of indigenous knowledge. There is a deep and rich tradition of radical Caribbean knowledge, not only in the academic sense, but also in the non-academic sense. And I like that Don spoke about some of this being manifested within the Rastafarians, within some of the traditions of Caribbean feminism. So there is this rich legacy of Caribbean critical thought that is there. Yet at the same time, for us to even see this, there has to be a process of epistemic decolonization, to quote a concept from Anthony Bogues. So this process of epistemic decolonization would not only allow us to understand the often invisible structures of coloniality, but also to recognize the invisible structures of decoloniality. Because both in the realms of dominant power structures are rendered invisible. They are there behind the surface. They are having a deep impact upon how we think, what we think, who we see, what we value as important, what we see as beautiful, who we recognize as being thinkers and who are not. Yet at the same time, because much of the mechanisms of this is concealed, it really isn't there on the table for us to address properly. The fact that Arthur Lewis drew mainly on the epistemologies of Euro-America, even while seeking to create Caribbean development, was something that was clear to radical Caribbean thinkers, some of whom call Lewis a Black Englishman. Norman Govan recounts that Arthur Lewis, with his English accent and bearing similar to that of an English academic, was the epitome of a Black Englishman. One member of the New World group, Carrie Levitt, in a seminar spoke glowingly about her time at the University of the West Indies while Sir Arthur Lewis was principal. But she also noted that the Jamaican campus was like a little England during the time that he was principal. So how do we understand the weight and pressures that would have shaped Caribbean thinkers during this time? And I agree with authors such as Tennyson Joseph and Norman Govan that it is important to understand Sir Arthur Lewis in his historical context. While it is easy to dismiss him for aspects of his work that may have seemed to open the door for foreign domination, I think that understanding the pressures and weight of coloniality that would have shaped him is important to understanding and working our way out of our own development quagmire, where most of the models of development come from countries or interests aligned to the global north. So the same pressures that would have been bearing down on Arthur Lewis and would have produced a Black Englishman are also bearing down on us through a certain degree of hegemony on the global production of knowledge, as well as the internal dimensions of a plantation economy and society. So even though the form and manifestation will be different, there are many aspects of the analysis and the context that he had to navigate growing up as a child within a British Empire to whom it was said that the sun would never set, I think is worthy of consideration. As much as Arthur Lewis's industrialization proposals stemmed from an interest in seeing Caribbean people transform, and as much as it challenged the international division of production, the model did not address the root causes of Caribbean underdevelopment. Consider this statement by Lewis. The colonies are poor because the colonial peoples have not learned how to master their environment. Their techniques and their tools are primitive, their hygiene deplorable, and their attitudes too frequently a fatalistic acceptance of their condition as being inevitable. To use the words of Norman Govan, Sir Arthur Lewis was a man of his time, ahead of his time. As a man of his time, Lewis was socialized in a social space marked by the epistemic and repressive violence of coloniality. The education system in which he excelled and the wider society was dominated by British values and epistemologies that held Western society as the epistemology of civilization and development. He grew up in a context where there were higher degrees of coloniality relative to decoloniality than which exists today. In this sense, Lewis's ideas of concessions for foreign corporations align closely with contemporary narratives of neoliberalism that give private capitalists expanded power and reach into every aspect of human existence. The danger of putting profits and economic growth above people, including the effects on ecological systems, is one of the main threats facing Caribbean peoples. And there is a quote from one of my favorite writers, Ramon Grosfagel, when he says that any model that does not have at its center the challenging of coloniality is merely a repackaging of domination. And he goes on to say that a global problem cannot be solved at the level of the nation state. These concepts and ways of seeing the relations of power are quite important, because if we are to understand the root causes of Caribbean underdevelopment as being something that first emanates from a global 500-year pattern of power relations, then addressing underdevelopment cannot simply be achieved by the state making adjustments to its spending or its choices as to how it spends its resources. There has to be an acknowledgement, firstly, of the root causes of underdevelopment and an adjustment within the global patterns of power, so that states that have an alternative paradigm of development are able to network and share resources and insights. And what I'm saying could be understood by this example. More than 50 years after independence, what are the organizations, the global organizations that Caribbean countries are part of, apart from which have been created by global centers of capitalism? So we belong to the Commonwealth of Nations, whose symbolic head is the Queen of England. But where is the global organization of global South countries that can seek to understand and approach global development and relations from an inherently Caribbean or global South perspective? And if we are to understand development knowledge from this perspective, then there's a certain degree of Caribbean subservience to these hegemonic development paradigms. And I happen to be reading a very exciting article on how the Caribbean is subscribed to a range of very Western development paradigms. However, while reading the article, the author still subscribed to concepts of developing countries to refer to the Caribbean and developed countries to refer to the United States and other European countries. But who determines who is developed and developing, and who has the power and the privilege to name itself developed and to set its own systems and agenda as the pathway for all others to progress? And this is one of the false privileges accorded to dominant Western countries in the current scheme of things. We also have concepts of sustainable development goals, whereby a range of Caribbean countries and countries of the global South are adjusting and constructing their concepts of national development to adhere to these sustainable development goals coming out of the United Nations. We have a number of smaller scale local organizations where, to get funding, they would have to speak the language of sustainable development in order to qualify for certain grants. And this continues a pattern of top-down development that has not really been about Caribbean people being able to stand on our own 2 feet and be able to define development according to lens, concepts, and realities that are facing us. And although at times the state has been described as being a key factor in achieving development, even by Sir Arthur Lewis, this perspective has not really been considerate of the fact that the shift from colonialism to independence has seen a rise in various Caribbean countries of a predatory capitalist state, which does not properly protect the rights and interests of its citizens, but more so aligns with internal and global capitalist interests. And this has serious consequences, not only for people and their livelihood and sense of development and sense of being and their sense of independence, but also for the maintenance and conservation of the natural spaces all across the Caribbean region. One example of this is really the Vision 2020 and Vision 2030 plans that has been put forward by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And when you really get into the nitty-gritty of these plans, you have a lot of the fancy words of sustainable development, of inclusion, of democracy. Yet at the same time, beyond these fancy words, there is little or no substance by which a Caribbean country can be able to tap into its indigenous knowledge, to be able to build upon the critical human resources that are present, and really follow through with a bottom-up model of development that really taps into the potential of the people. Instead, beyond these fancy words, it perpetuates a traditional top-down capitalist model of development in which the state may have its consultations, but beyond that, there is really no real connection to some of the alternative, critical, and decolonial work that is being done in different communities and by different organizations. So in the context of criticisms of contemporary models of growth that was mentioned by Don, we have the concept of degrowth that deeply criticizes economic growth as being any viable endpoint that countries should be going after. And in this context of degrowth, we also have the related notions of not necessarily subscribing to the endpoints of capitalist development. And there is just so many basic information and articles available that explain how economic growth doesn't quite equal to development. In closing, I would want to go back to one of the most important critical Caribbean scholars to further stretch our understanding of Arthur Lewis and some of his strengths and weaknesses. And I want to quote from Walter Rodney, writing in 1972. And he says that as late as the 1950s, it was felt that so long as you could industrialize, it was great, because the old colonial division of labor stopped us from industrializing. And so people began to industrialize. People began, however, to ask new and searching questions about the character of industrialization. What is it all about? Who owns? Who controls? What do you actually produce? Does it help the development of our economy? Does it make us more independent? And these words written in 1972 are perhaps even more important than the period in which it was written. So as we are facing a collapse in this post-COVID scenario and environment of some of the traditional industries, this crisis really represents an opportunity for us to revisit some of the critical Caribbean scholars, both academic and non-academic, who have laid out important points related to our development and redevelopment that has been sidelined and erased and and dismissed, while different Caribbean countries pursued a mirage of Western economic development that, despite all its promises and its bling bling, has not really been able to achieve the promises that it laid on the table. The work of Arthur Lewis to keep the University of the West Indies alive and his insistence that the university study the issues of the region is again a next important aspect of his life and his work. And it even helps us to understand the importance and the evolution of Caribbean knowledge. So Arthur Lewis, like Eric Williams, is an example of the contradictions present in the Caribbean space. And as much as he was able to put forward very sharp and cutting-edge critiques that located the root causes of Caribbean underdevelopment in British colonial policies, some of his later work didn't properly center the patterns of coloniality that we now have to go back and revisit if we are able to move towards any alternative decolonial model of development. And I want to ask the question, if Arthur Lewis was not elevated at the London School of Economics, if he was not awarded a knighthood and not awarded a Nobel Prize, would he be so widely celebrated in the Caribbean? And this question really seeks to challenge some of the measures by which we elevate some of our people and the means and mechanisms by which there is an entire body of Caribbean decolonial thought that is invisible, that we don't see as important because they have not been recognized by structures of power. And so it is thus important for me not to recognize and celebrate the parts of Arthur Lewis that was comforting to global centers of power, but the parts of him that for me most represented that decolonial Caribbean spirit that is very much needed within the contemporary Caribbean. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salandy, for your presentation. And so that will conclude all of the presentations this afternoon. So now we can get into some of the questions and answers that we have to give. So in the chat, there was a question here for Dr. Mohan. Dr. Mohan, the question is, can you please share some thoughts on how harnessing of renewable energy technologies is planned in Trinidad and Tobago?
Thank you, Professor Ghany, and thank you for the question from the chat. Now, the government of Trinidad and Tobago would have recently developed a national energy policy green paper, which recognizes renewable energy combined with energy efficiency and utilization of natural gas for transportation. Now, this green paper outlines a lot of tax credits, import duty exemptions, education and training, etc. But with the green policy being developed, I want to say that the reality is that in Trinidad and Tobago, renewable energy remains very much, makes up a small part of our energy use. Compared to all of the Caribbean, you would also always read that the Caribbean faces high energy costs, and attached to that line, you would always read except Trinidad and Tobago. So because of our low energy costs, our transition to renewable energy remains very low. And of course, there's the obvious solar power that we in the Caribbean, including Trinidad and Tobago, could transition towards. But I want to reiterate a point that Dr. Marshall would have made when he made the point of reducing the energy bill, and he spoke about bioenergy. So Trinidad and Tobago is one of the highest per capita pollutant in the world. We are among the highest producers of waste per capita. And a lot of that waste can be converted into bioenergy. And a similar strategy can be developed across the other Caribbean countries, given our similar structures in terms of producing waste and that waste not being properly disposed of. So I would like to endorse what Dr. Marshall was saying about developing bioenergy in the region. I see that as a sustainable path towards renewable energy production in the region that's often ignored. We often speak of solar energy in the Caribbean, but bioenergy is very much a viable alternative.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for your response. Another question in the chat: what was Jamaica's rationale for withdrawing from the Federation? Essentially, this had been a matter of some dispute between Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley in Jamaica. And in 1960, in May of 1960, Norman Manley committed himself to having a referendum on the subject of Jamaica's involvement in the Federation. And after the Independence Conference for the Federation, being held at Lancaster House in March of 1961. In the aftermath of that, Norman Manley arranged for a referendum to be held in Jamaica on the 19th of September 1961. And the result of the referendum was a majority voting in favor of Jamaica seceding. So it was an act of self-determination where the electorate of Jamaica was given the opportunity to vote yes or no on the question of the continuation in the Federation. There's another question in the chat here. Based on the Williams-Lewis relationship, what are the implications of academics advising politicians in the Caribbean? Quite an interesting question. We see that it goes right back to this particular period. Essentially, what happened here is that Lewis had approached Adams. From what I have seen in the confidential documents, both of the Colonial Office and as well of the Federation of the West Indies. And from what I have seen, it was Lewis who approached Adams. Adams agreed to it and then put it before the federal cabinet for approval. So it was more or less a ratification of what the Prime Minister had decided. So that it's pretty much a two-way street. The academics and the politicians and giving advice is a well-worn reality. And the implication here obviously is that Williams not being necessarily a fan of Adams and vice versa, and Lewis caught in the middle. The implication was that the advice, the research, and everything else that went with it obviously suffered in the long run. Question here: what does Dr. Marshall think that, why does Dr. Marshall think that entrepreneurship implies neoliberalism? Don, you want to answer that question? It was directed for you in the chat.
Okay, yes, I
think that entrepreneurship implies neoliberalism.
Right. What I would have responded to him in the chat, what I would say here for those that might be listening or watching and who didn't benefit from the response, just simply to say that I wasn't making a connection between entrepreneurial expression and the question about neoliberalism. What I was simply saying is that quite often the solution and the counsel that we receive, that neoliberal counsel and solution that we normally receive, is one based on advice that we need more persons to pursue an entrepreneurial route towards self-actualization. Governments are often advised as well that they should, as it were, not make any interventions in the economy because this will in some way act as a heavy hand or it would stymie or undercut the potential for entrepreneurial expressions in those areas. So we could say that when governments provide subsidized meals for primary school children in order to ensure healthy lifestyles and the rest of it, the argument could be that private caterers can do that, the government instead should create a situation where entrepreneurs could set up small businesses and offer those kinds of healthy alternatives to the primary school children in the country. And while this is a reasonable position on its own, I ask that we also look at the premises, and the premise inherent is that entrepreneurial pursuits are open to all with investment-worthy ideas, and we know that that's not really the truth in our region because of history and because of the absence of middle-class development and intergenerational wealth, I mean to say. So it is not what entrepreneurship for some is participating in the informal economy. Entrepreneurship for some others may be hustling, and so on. And entrepreneurship for others may take on, larger ideas with longer and costly gestation periods before you can realize lumps of profit. And we know that those with the collateralizable wealth and intergenerational wealth background can undertake those ideas that calls for a long-term investment and a delay in realizing returns and so on. So all that is to say, you have to problematize what you mean by saying just allow the market to rip, just allow entrepreneurs to fulfill the needs of society and so on. And I was just careful to say, look, it doesn't quite work like that. In some cases, the state has to create windows, finance windows with softer terms than banks to allow for ideational expression in, say, coming up with solar technology goods or coming up with biodesign ideas and so on. The state has to incentivize that by putting resources at their disposal and to get them away from debt finance structures where before you can even get your business off the ground, you've got that loan to repay.
Okay, thank you, Don. There's another question here. Undoubtedly, climate change bears considerable significance for the region, its development and survival. In the region's quest to essentially navigate the international political economy, some CARICOM nations have explored climate change mitigation efforts such as REDD+. Do you know whether any manner of research has been undertaken concerning either the viability and or level of impact concerning such mitigation efforts?
No, I wouldn't know. I don't know that. I'm not familiar with it, but the example, the principle that they want to identify in the question is something that I share, this idea of, working collectively to solve predicaments that they face as countries and using global governance institutions or regimes to probably put a position. So I know that the question, for example, of the tendency to blacklist a number of Caribbean countries for a number of its measures that it puts in place is something that regional, one of our think tank institutions within the University of the West Indies, the Sridhar Ramphal Center for Trade Policy, has been advising one or two governments on a strategy forward, a strategy to assist in more or less pressing the case that this is in violation of international law and the rest of it. So this kind of concerted effort to use the existing global structures to challenge rules, or rather to challenge attempts at bullying or attempts at dispossessing Caribbean countries from exercising certain kinds of policy options is something that I applaud.
Okay. There's another question here for you, Dr. Marshall.
Professor Ghany, can I just respond to the climate question?
Yes, yes, please do.
Yes, thanks for the question. Now, I'm not very familiar with the specific research, like I'm not able to list papers for you currently, but I know through natural science research, we do have papers on the Caribbean in terms of mitigation strategies and their effectiveness in the region. But the point I want to raise to that comment is that Dominica, after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, they set a very ambitious goal, and Dominica set the goal of becoming the first climate resilient country in the world and the first hurricane-proof country in the world. And now I bring up this example to highlight the point that we in the Caribbean can be leading examples to the world in terms of our own strategies, our own growth strategies going forward, and how we tackle issues of development. And I just wanted to highlight this very ambitious goal set by Dominica, and the government of Dominica. They do have written plans and strategies in place, and they track very closely this progress. And if you go and look into those policies and plans, you would see that type of information coming out.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mohan. There's another question here for Dr. Marshall. Would this consider non-market goods in providing a basic level of living? For instance, some people in rural areas in Jamaica are almost, if not totally, food sufficient. Migration to Kingston or other urban areas to earn or become employed sometimes result in their being worse off. Your thoughts, Dr. Marshall? Put your microphone on. Can you unmute? Yeah.
Sorry about that, Hamid. Yes, this was asked and I answered in the chat. It was shared just briefly. Those persons that have achieved a level of food self-sufficiency ignored in the past really have to be highlighted. Their examples have to be highlighted as best practice going forward. I mean, there's a way in which, because supply chains have been, thrown away or have gone away because of the uncertainty of open borders and ports. I've seen an upsurge, for example, in the sale of, and this is within Barbados, I've seen the upsurge in sale of agricultural products. And I think this is to the good. I have also seen an upsurge in people turning towards their small plots of land, however small and minuscule, for kitchen garden purposes. I've also, and this is not a casual observation, seen our market square with agricultural produce from boats from nearby islands, swelling. So, the people in the region, the people on the ground are actually beginning to exercise the food self-sufficiency required at the national and regional level. And they're leading their governments, they're leading their members of parliament in establishing clearly the way forward for a region like ours. And it's only a matter of, I think it's a matter of urgent policy that we rethink, what a CSME would mean if it's augmented with some of the very concerns that Norman Governor raised about the need for production, integration, coordination. CSME as it is remains a market-led conception model of development, something that we ought to resist, because if you leave the CSME to market forces, if you leave it to just a matter as well of the discussion of the administration of things, you're not going to get the dynamism that's required at the regional level. So what we need to do is to encourage our governments and encourage other powerful lobbies to move in the direction of production integration. And if you talk about, for example, food security, as very, very critical for the region, then it's something that we can have various lobbies, farmers' lobbies and so on around the region rallying around and pushing their governments towards establishing. There is scope for it. And I think we just need to make sure that we put enough pressure on the powers that be to see this thing happening. The CSME right now is anemic, and it's anemic precisely because a market-led conception is not going to drive the process forward, really. It has to be deliberately purpose-driven. And COVID is driving us in the direction of at least satisfying the need to meet the food and related health concerns facing the region.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marshall. There's a question here. Can Dr. Salandy share the sources of Lewis's earlier activism and ideas? Tyehimba?
Right. So I posted some of these in chat, but I'll just list it quickly. The main ones are a text from Arthur Lewis himself called Labor in the West Indies, the Birth of a Worker Movement. And you also have a text by Robert Tigner called Arthur Lewis and the Birth of Development Economics. Especially the latter one goes in depth in terms of the life and times of Arthur Lewis, especially in his early days and the types of activism that he would have been involved in.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How far would you say that Sir Arthur Lewis's major ideas, example his ideas of industrialization by invitation, was influenced by the political and social impacts of World War I?
Yeah, so it certainly was, but then again, you also have evidence of some of his core ideas existing even earlier. So for example, in his submissions to the Moyne Commission, Sir Arthur Lewis would have made recommendations for the industrialization of the West Indies. And these recommendations were clearly ignored. So then after this, you see evidence of Arthur Lewis evolving and refining these ideas over time.
Okay, there's another question here. Would a Caribbean academic who engages with these same issues and comes up with similar analyses and conclusions as our last presenter, meaning you, but who considered this in poetry and other literary works, be recognized as part of the development discourse? Perhaps the traditional disciplinary strictures of recognizing or acknowledging contributions reflects colonially, even in this respect.
Yes, interesting question. And I don't think so. I think that we have...
Coloniality, I think she meant, yes.
Yes, I got that. I think we have the presence of different entangled hierarchies, ways of being and seeing that put one way of being over another. And this certainly affects the disciplines where you have certain disciplines, be it engineering or medicine, being seen as being superior and better than and more desirable than other disciplines. But I would stretch the question even further. And I would ask, would a Caribbean thinker who is non-academic and who may just be an ordinary grassroots thinker, if he were to put forward a very powerful and important model of development, would he be considered and seen as worthy and elevated? And this to me, comes down to the question of a certain degree of academic privilege. And so far as there have been some resistance and some decolonial thoughts coming out of Caribbean academia, we also have to recognize and be able to elevate the non-academic aspects of decoloniality, which I think is an important part of untangling this thought process that elevates an academic way of being rooted in a sort of Western academic tradition over non-academics.
All right, there's another question here for you. How relevant is Sir Arthur Lewis's original propositions to contemporary Caribbean?
So I'm not sure which propositions are being perceived as being original. if we are to take the young Arthur Lewis and some of his foundation challenges to the British Home Office, these challenges are still very important because although we are not presently under colonial rule, the very experience of coloniality and the types of inequality that we have could be traced back to the colonial experience. In terms of his later writings of industrialization and economic growth, I think that there is benefit in the Caribbean having the power and the confidence to challenge or to undertake any pathway of development that we choose. And Arthur Lewis was correct in being able to put forward the Caribbean ability and right to do so. The pathway that he saw for this and the ways that it may not have challenged some of the deeper roots of underdevelopment that he would have recognized and identified in his earlier work. Again, it's part of what would have to be navigated presently, because to simply take the later parts of Sir Arthur Lewis's work would be to reinforce the domination of the economy and society by interests whose record has not really been in the best interest of Caribbean peoples or the environment within the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mohan, question here for you. How can economic/industrial diversification be achieved successfully? There are seemingly many obstacles. What are suggested new products?
Thank you for the question. I think Dr. Marshall would have addressed this question and me in our presentations and in answering the questions. Just to sort of reiterate, I think Dr. Marshall made a good point where he emphasized the three main areas where we should focus our production, as COVID-19 would have highlighted, and these would have been to reduce our food bill, our medical bill, and our energy bill. So he would have set us on the direction of increasing food production, medical production, and energy. Now, in my own presentation, through the use of various economic type modeling and trade indices, you would see that we as economists come up with comparative advantage, and this would reveal products that we in the Caribbean should diversify towards. And I would have highlighted in the tourism sector, upgrading towards the younger generation for travel, and also the ultra wealthy individuals. And also light manufacturing sectors would have been identified, such as agro-processing, woodworking, cosmetics, etc. So through economic modeling, these are the products that would be derived from these models. But just to sort of break it down on a more, let's say, less complicated way of thinking, we would say that the government should really create the necessary conditions for entrepreneurs to then take up the opportunities to find the products that they would want to produce. So what does that mean? You want the government to improve the ease of doing business so that entrepreneurs are able to execute their ideas and reduce these obstacles that entrepreneurs may face. And that's how you would come up with an ideal export or product that is being demanded. And in our own research in the Caribbean, you would see that among the top obstacles, finance, no doubt, access to finance by small businesses. So how do we reduce the cost and availability of finance to entrepreneurs? We also see that knowledge is a main obstacle facing firms. And by knowledge, we do not mean knowledge you gain by going to primary school, secondary school, and university to have an education, but real training in how you identify entrepreneurial opportunities and converting knowledge from the school to the workplace. So that type of knowledge is missing. Also, entrepreneurs would have complained about access to markets. So you would develop a product and then it's difficult to get that product to market. So these are just some of the obstacles that are being faced by entrepreneurs, and it's up to government to really reduce these type of obstacles and allow entrepreneurs to be able to take advantage of the opportunities when they present themselves.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mohan. Don, you want to take this one? How disruptive or instructive are the old institutions to Caribbean growth? Caribbean institutions were developed primarily to support extractions of resources from the Caribbean. Are these still relevant? Do we need to consider more specific justice, financial, market, education institutions that better support the Caribbean way forward?
I would want to say agree with the latter, you know, consider more specific justice, financial, market, education institutions to better support Caribbean way forward. But I would want to say that, look, these institutions are not, you know, these institutions are peopled institutions, and once human agents are occupy these organizations, the question is, what values will drive them? You know, what will be the aims, what will be the values? Because you've inherited particular kinds of institutions that are extractive, it means when you're remodeling going forward, it doesn't mean that when you're remodeling going forward that you carry forward the same kinds of mandates that they were originally created to so serve. So, for example, we inherited Westminster model, we inherited education boards and so on. It does not stand, there's nothing stopping any government in the region from repurposing their public services to suit developmental ends. So we have, for example, in the region, a high degree of university degree holders. And when I say university degrees, I'm talking about from the humanities through to the social sciences, through to the medical sciences and so on. We have some of the finest minds in the classrooms, teaching in secondary schools and so on. If government had a clear developmental plan girding an industrial strategy, an industrial policy strategy in the direction of value-added, say, in the area of alcoholic blends. I'm just throwing up that as an idea because Preeya was speaking about value-added and value-added impetus needed, right? So if there was a national campaign in somewhere like Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago or St. Lucia to add value to the beverages, the local beverages that's being produced, whether for export or for local consumption. If this was a national-wide campaign involving schools, community groups and so on, and your households are encouraged to, you know, to participate in this, people will be growing the relevant fruits, the cherry trees, people will be willing to pick the cherries and do different things as part of this activist state-led drive that features many players, private sector and others involved in it. And you won't be saying then that the public service agencies put to work to make this plan work are serving colonial ends. You'll be saying that these very institutions inherited have been repurposed towards and repurposed to meet a particular goal as set out by the state. So sometimes when people hear the view that the state should take the lead, they mistakenly believe out of pure ideological purposes that you're talking about the state taking over. And I'm saying that the state in these parts has to play a sort of kind of a catalyzing role. And if it's to play a catalytic role, it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually intervenes, runs the business, and then hand over. I mean, that's one model, but it doesn't have to always do that. So there is then the once you're talking about the state playing a more purposeful catalyzing role, it then stands to follow that the agencies, the public servant organizations, public service organizations have to change, have to be repurposed, and certain kinds of key performance metrics have to be incorporated if you are going to follow an industrial deepening plan. And I don't know what will drive are custodians of state to move in this required direction, but they can look no further than the example that many of them have exercised in the use of the state to support tourism. Tourism is one of those industries in the region that is saturated with subsidy. Tourism is one of those areas in the region, this is state dominated. And we are seeing it manifested even more during the COVID emergency, where hoteliers seem not to have had a business plan other than to simply rely on the state to bail it out in the event of a 2-month lockdown and no tourists coming. All of a sudden, they're saying that they're financially cash-strapped and the rest of it. That's another discussion for another forum. But if you want an example of the potential of the Caribbean state to be a catalyzing force for development, look no further than tourism development in the region. And you have a classic case of that defies the neoliberal logic that market players should be in this area alone and hoteliers should run the roofs and so on and so forth. That's not the case. Right? Taxpayers' dollars support and socialize the losses that hoteliers are currently facing right now. And the ethics of that is a subject for discussion. But as we speak right now, the entire hospitality sector and industry is being supported by taxpayers' dollars.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marshall. Dr. Mohan, there's a question here for you. How do you see the commitment to the Paris Agreement being impacted due to the COVID challenges?
Thank you for the question. I mean, in a pandemic, there's not a lot of good that can come out of it, but I think one lesson that we should take out of COVID-19 is the awareness of our environmental impact and the environmental footprint that we leave on the planet. During lockdown, we would have seen that our emissions would have declined significantly. And now we have scientific studies that show that not long after coming out of lockdown, those emissions are now back up to where they were. And obviously, we can't realistically lock down to keep emissions down and to save the planet. We need to balance the economic with the environmental. So I think COVID-19 would really help to reinforce the commitment to the Paris Agreement. I think we're seeing very positive moves with the US now rejoining the agreement. And I'll use the opportunity to raise a point that was brought up in the chat and something I wanted to raise by Dr. Northover in the chat of the circular economy. As we go forward post-COVID and we think of new growth models, our old production system is really based on a make, use, dispose type linear modeling. And in going forward, the circular economy concept is where we really seek to eliminate waste and have the continual use of our resources. And these are the types of issues that COVID would have brought to the forefront. And one positive out of COVID that we should take with us is really balancing the environmental with the economic. Now, COVID also exposed social vulnerabilities, and that's the other angle, but that's another discussion. And I'll leave that to probably Dr. Salandy to go into that with his responses later on.
Right, thank you, Dr. Mohan. The question here to Dr. Salandy, is it true that grassroots approach to the economy hasn't been tried and recognized? What about the people production plan in Jamaica as people-based development agenda? Would you see this then as a need for better and more powerful sustainable development governance plans to be rolled out at the local government level? Don?
Yes, good question. However, before I respond to this, I just want to quickly respond to the question raised by Christine Taylor in the chat about all institutions and its relevance and impact on Caribbean growth. And I want to ask the question, is it possible to build an authentic Caribbean development on top of these old-style colonial institutions? And I don't want to give the impression that all of our institutions are just colonial, because that would kind of erase Caribbean agency. But yet, at the same time, how do we conceptualize and engage development as freedom when the institutions from which people are emerging are so problematic? When we look at, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, if we are to look at our justice system, governance, the education system, the operation of churches, there's a high degree of coloniality that leads to a certain degree of subscription to a global pattern of power relations. So how is it that we could build any meaningful sense of Caribbean development without addressing the essence and character of a lot of these Caribbean institutions? And addressing this would really take us back to the root of the very essence of what is the Caribbean and what is the origins of all of our societies. In this question too, the point of food security and agriculture came up. And since COVID-19, I have seen an upsurge and an increase in agricultural production. But more so, I have seen a high attention and interest by ordinary people who would not traditionally be in the garden to engage in different home gardening, and planting different crops to reduce their food bill. Within this, the emphasis cannot just be on the Caribbean producing more food locally, but how do we do this? Trinidad, which is widely seen as the most developed country in the Caribbean, I disagree with that, but that's a topic for another conversation. Trinidad has one of the highest rates of pollution by chemical and pesticide residues. It has also one of the highest rates of lifestyle diseases. And although our farmers are producing food, they are doing so by mainly a sort of industrial approach to agriculture, which sprays high levels of toxic synthetic chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides on the plants. So for me, it's not just about planting more food, but about embracing a more sustainable and regenerative form of agriculture that doesn't simply put profits over people's health, but seeks to find more holistic and sustainable and regenerative ways of doing agriculture.
Okay,
to address the point made by Patricia Northover quickly, the grassroots economy or the grassroots approach to the economy, there has been elements of this practice in the Caribbean. You have in Jamaica, in Grenada, and Cuba. But I'm also reminded of the work by William Blum, where he talks about the fact that any non-capitalist model of development has been so deeply interfered with and intervened in that we have not really been able to work out the merits of these projects because of the overarching context of imperial intervention. So that could also be considered in some of these projects supposedly failing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Salandy. There's another question here. Dr. Marshall, quite a few small island nations have already opened their borders to ensure that their tourism-based economy sustains. What is your thought about strategies to be applied in the Trinidad and Tobago scenario?
Well, I'm sure Preeya could also assist yourself, Hamid, in answering this because you're immediately always on the scene and so on. But Trinidad is an exciting prospect because it has, unlike other countries in the region, it has contemplated in the past industrial development possibilities. Some may point to side factors like oil and oil-based economy approach, but petrochemical, based approach. But I do also believe that there has always been within Trinidad and Tobago a sense in which ways in which one could pursue, or ways in which the the wealthy elite could pursue their own reproduction was through means other than simply that relates to buying and selling, real estate, prospecting, or investing in finance, banking, insurance, and so on. There's always been a greater expression of capitalist investment and pursuits in Trinidad and Tobago, and that needs to be historicized and addressed. I think at this point, right now, in relation to where Trinidad and Tobago stands, I do believe that it can really make a deep dive in the direction of value added in terms of its beverages and its beverage exports, food and beverages, I should say. I also think it can make a deep dive in the area of pharmaceutical research, or encouraging pharmaceutical research, as well as ocean-based research as well. I think there's scope for Trinidad to contemplate as well the whole business of what's that? I'm trying to remember the term that is linked to aquaculture. Yes, aquaculture. I know there is an institution there, a research institution, but there seem to be some side factors in Trinidad, as well as the proclivities of the wealthy elite to make investments in other non-traditional areas, and particularly areas that are involved in the making and production of things and products. And so I think Trinidad is particularly well poised to contemplate a deeper dive industrially than other countries are.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marshall. Some more questions here. Before I go on, Dr. Mohan, did you want to just come in on that issue of the tourism-based economy and strategies to be applied in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, to just say that the World Tourism Organization and the World Health Organization do have guidelines as to how we resume safe international travel, and it's really up to the authorities to decide whether they would have an open border or closed border. At this point, I think transparency and trust from the public is what would make the policy a success.
Okay, thank you. Right, there's a question here. How would you transform the UWI as a development institution in the Caribbean? Don, you have some thoughts here?
Well, I like the question because it turns on many facets. But let me just say that we shouldn't ignore, above all, the relations of power. Many of us that are in the business of speaking about development, whether we are drawn from social sciences or, as the brother was saying in the chat, drawn from other fields of endeavor, right? And speak about what freedom will look like, or what the ideal society and economy should look like, and what it means to be a citizen, and so on. Those questions are not specific and germane only to social scientists. Persons across different disciplines or orientations not only are free to do so, but have been intervening. Intellectuals outside the academy have also been intervening. Thought leaders outside of the academy have also been intervening in those discussions. The question then is the relations of power in relation to how inclusive are the regimes, the ruling regimes, in relation to these new ideas, and to inviting, representatives of these ideas to join them in discussions on the way forward. So for me, I have a problem. My first order question I want settled is, what it is that the University of the West Indies, by dint of the many work being produced in various forms addressing the development problematique and the problem constellation around values, why is it that our social partnerships writ large, I'm talking about across the region, do not necessarily include the academy, right? And I'm not making a plug that's simply for the University of the West Indies. I'm making a plug for, to bring the intelligentsia in, through various mechanisms, bring them into the policymaking circle. I know that while some of us may serve on boards, some of us may be advisors, some of us may be consultants, ultimately those are handpicked, and while they will act professionally and so on, there are always alternative views being expressed that never see the light of day. I can go on and on, but I would just leave that there to say that I do believe the University of the West Indies does address Caribbean development, Caribbean issues, and there are particular institutes and centers that have been established and that have continued to serve governments as well as serve international agencies as well on this whole question of development and development as freedom. Now, other than that, I would yield and just allow somebody else to answer, but I think I've said a few things.
All right, well, colleagues, and thank you, Don. Colleagues, at this point, I'm going to have to start the wrapping up because we are coming up on the 4:30 time slot, which is the point of our termination for this symposium. I want to begin by thanking all of the presenters here today, Dr. Mohan, Dr. Marshall, Dr. Salandy, for submitting presentations for this event, further to my putting out a call for presentations, and for us maintaining a tradition of having an annual discourse on the life and work of Sir Arthur Lewis and relating a lot of that work to contemporary Caribbean realities. I also want to thank a lot of people behind the scenes, namely the Marketing and Communications Office, Ms. Shireen Ali and her colleagues. I also want to thank in my office, Ms. Sharon Hodge, who has continued to support all of our distance and outreach activities and has assisted in making today's event possible. I also want to thank a number of other colleagues who have been very supportive behind the scenes, and you may not normally see or hear of them, but nevertheless, I just want to say how grateful I am for all the support that I've received for this. My colleagues across the region as well, in SALISES at Cave Hill and at Mona, the University Director, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, for her ongoing support for all of our activities here at St. Augustine. Our next major event will be the SALISES St. Augustine Research Days, which will be held over the period the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of February. So that's next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That too is going into its 4th edition to highlight the work and the research work going on here at SALISES St. Augustine. So in closing, let me say how grateful I am to all of you who stayed the distance with us and participated in this event. And I hope that we have been able to learn something new from what we had today. So thank you very much to those of you who have come from different time zones, and I'm seeing the list of persons here, time zones in Europe, time zones in Canada, and Midwestern United States, the East Coast of United States, and across the Caribbean. Thank you so much, and look forward to further events highlighting the work of Sir Arthur Lewis as we go forward. Do have a very good afternoon, and it's afternoon for everyone who is now participating with us here today. Thank you and goodbye.